Born enslaved on the eastern shore of Maryland, Harriet Tubman entered a world designed to deny her choice, voice, and future. Yet the story of her escape in 1849 is not a tale of sudden impulse or blind luck. It is a story of careful preparation, quiet resistance, and an unbreakable will formed under the harshest conditions. Long before she ever stepped onto the road to freedom, Tubman was already planning listening, learning routes, memorizing landscapes, and building trust within invisible networks that stretched far beyond any single plantation. For years, she watched how enslaved people communicated without being heard, how free black communities offered shelter at great personal risk, and how abolitionists passed information in whispers rather than declarations. When the moment came, Tubman did not run in panic. She moved with intention. Every step north was guided by knowledge, courage, and a deep understanding that freedom was not given, it was taken. This moment matters because it challenges one of the most persistent myths about slavery, the idea that enslaved people were merely passive victims of history. Tubman's escape reminds us that resistance existed everywhere, sometimes loud, sometimes silent, but always deliberate. Her journey was not only about saving herself. It was the first act in a lifelong commitment to help others break free from the same system that once held her. As we begin this story, look beyond the legend and focus on the human choices behind it. Harriet Tubman was not born a symbol, she became one through action, planning, and resolve. If you value stories that uncover the deeper truths behind history, support this channel by liking the video, subscribing, and staying with us as we explore the real forces that shaped lives, courage, and resistance. After her escape from Maryland, Harriet Tubman did not step into freedom as a solitary figure standing apart from the world she had left behind. Instead, she entered a wider, hidden landscape of resistance that already existed, one built quietly by free black communities, formerly enslaved people, and a small number of committed allies who understood that survival depended on trust, secrecy, and cooperation. The road north was not a single path but a web of human connections, and Tubman learned quickly that freedom was sustained not by individual heroism alone, but by collective effort. In the towns and rural settlements along the way, free black families opened their doors without knowing who might be watching. Churches became meeting points, kitchens turned into planning rooms, and everyday routines disguised acts of defiance. Messages were passed through coded language, gestures, and songs whose meanings were invisible to outsiders. Tubman absorbed these methods not as abstract ideas, but as lived knowledge. Each safe house, each whispered direction, reinforced the understanding that resistance was organized, intentional, and deeply rooted in community. When Tubman chose to return south, she did not do so as a lone rescuer acting on instinct. She moved as a conductor within this network, coordinating timing, routes, and human relationships with extraordinary precision. Every journey required assessing who could be trusted, which paths were still safe, and how attention might be diverted if danger drew too close. The risks were real and constant, but the system worked because it relied on shared responsibility rather than individual fame. No one person could succeed alone, and Tubman never pretended otherwise. This broader structure also reshapes how her courage should be understood. Her bravery did not come from ignoring danger, but from navigating it intelligently. She relied on information gathered by others, on shelters prepared in advance, and on the courage of people who would never be named in history books. Free black dockworkers, farmers, laborers, and families risked their livelihoods and their safety, not for recognition, but because freedom for one person strengthened the freedom of all. Abolitionists, both black and white, played their part as well. though their role was often less visible than later retellings suggest. They provided resources, legal knowledge, and sometimes transportation, but they were participants in a system shaped primarily by black leadership and experience. Tubman understood this balance clearly. She trusted those who proved themselves reliable, but she never surrendered control of the mission itself. The decisions remained grounded in first-hand knowledge of life under bondage and the realities of pursuit. By viewing Tubman within this organized resistance, the story becomes richer and more truthful. It moves away from the simplified image of a single hero defying history and toward a more powerful understanding of how oppressed people created systems of survival and liberation in a world designed to deny them both. Tubman's role was extraordinary, but it was extraordinary precisely because she knew how to work within and strengthen something larger than herself. This perspective does not diminish her legacy. It deepens it. It shows her not as a figure operating outside history, but as one who understood it intimately and learned how to bend it through cooperation, discipline, and shared purpose. The Underground Railroad was not a miracle, and it was not a myth. It was a living network of people who refused to accept the limits imposed on them, and Harriet Tubman stood at its center. Not alone, but surrounded by a community that believed freedom was worth the risk. With every successful journey north, Harriet Tubman understood that freedom carried a weight heavier than relief. Each safe arrival sharpened her awareness of those still left behind, and it was this sense of responsibility, rather than thrill or impulse, that drew her back into slaveholding states again and again. By the time word of her first return spread quietly through trusted circles, Tubman was no longer simply a woman who had escaped. She had become a guide, someone whose knowledge, discipline, and judgment could mean the difference between life in bondage and a future beyond it. Returning was never an act of reckless defiance. By then, Tubman knew how closely every road was watched, how easily fear could unravel even the best intentions, and how quickly a single mistake could endanger everyone involved. Bounties placed on her capture only increased these dangers, turning her presence into a liability as well as a promise. Yet she calculated risk with precision, choosing seasons, routes, and companions carefully, often changing plans at the last moment to avoid attention. She traveled mostly at night, avoided predictable patterns, and trusted information gathered from the same networks that had once helped her secure her own escape. Those she guided were not passive followers swept along by her will. They were men, women, and children carrying fear, hope, and doubt in equal measure. Tubman understood that courage alone was not enough to sustain them. She enforced strict rules, not out of cruelty, but because survival depended on unity and silence. Panic could draw attention, hesitation could expose a route, and turning back could threaten everyone who had offered shelter along the way. Her leadership rested on clarity and resolve, offering reassurance while demanding commitment. Each return journey required Tubman to move through landscapes filled with memory. These were places where she had once labored, suffered, and endured loss. She navigated not only physical terrain but emotional ground that could weaken even the strongest resolve. Yet she did not allow nostalgia or fear to dictate her actions. Instead, she transformed personal history into strategic advantage, using familiarity with local customs, dialects, and rhythms of daily life to remain unnoticed. Her strength lay in knowing when to move boldly and when to disappear entirely. Over time, her reputation grew, not through public recognition, but through quiet testimony. People spoke of a woman who never lost a person she guided, not because she was invulnerable, but because she planned relentlessly and adapted constantly. Her courage was measured, shaped by experience rather than impulse. She understood that bravery without strategy could cost lives, and she refused to gamble with the futures of those who trusted her. These repeated journeys reveal the true nature of Tubman's heroism. It was not defined by dramatic gestures or singular moments of triumph. but by consistency under pressure. Each successful escape strengthened the network that made the next one possible, reinforcing the collective effort that underpinned resistance. Tubman stood at the intersection of trust and action, carrying the weight of responsibility with every step. By returning at least 13 times, she challenged the idea that freedom was an individual achievement. Her story shows that liberation was an ongoing process, sustained by discipline, foresight, and an unwavering commitment to others. In choosing to go back, Tubman did not seek danger for its own sake. She accepted it because she understood that calculated courage, guided by purpose and preparation, could transform fear into movement and hope into reality. As Harriet Tubman moved through the shadowed world of escape and pursuit, faith was never separate from strategy in her mind. It shaped how she understood danger, how she endured fear, and how she made decisions when no clear path seemed safe. Raised in a religious tradition where spiritual belief was woven into daily survival, Tubman carried that faith with her not as passive comfort, but as a source of focus and direction. It grounded her resolve and gave meaning to risks that might otherwise have seemed unbearable. Yet faith alone did not guide her through hostile territory. Tubman paired belief with careful planning and an acute understanding of human behavior. She knew that those who hunted fugitives relied on predictability, fear, and confusion. To counter this, she turned ordinary expressions of culture into tools of navigation and warning. Songs sung softly along the road were never just melodies. Their lyrics, familiar to enslaved communities, carried layered meanings that signaled when it was safe to move, when danger was near, or when a route had to be abandoned. To an untrained ear, these sounds blended into the landscape. To those who understood, they were instructions. Misinformation became another form of protection. Tubman learned that controlling what others believed could be as powerful as controlling where they traveled. She allowed false leads to spread, redirected attention toward decoy paths, and timed movements to coincide with moments when vigilance was likely to drop. In towns where rumors traveled faster than truth, confusion worked in her favor. Every delay forced pursuers to divide their efforts, buying precious time for those moving quietly in the opposite direction. Discipline was the final element that held these journeys together. Tubman understood that fear could fracture even the strongest resolve, especially among people who had spent their lives under constant threat. She established clear expectations from the beginning, emphasizing silence, coordination, and trust. These rules were not imposed through force, but through shared understanding of the stakes involved. Everyone in the group carried responsibility for the safety of others, and Tubman made sure that this responsibility was understood before the first step was taken. Her leadership style reflected this balance between compassion and firmness. She offered reassurance through calm presence and confidence, often drawing on religious language that resonated deeply with those she guided. At the same time, she made it clear that hesitation or disobedience could endanger the entire network of people who had risked their safety to help. In moments of tension, she remained focused, adapting quickly when plans had to change, never allowing panic to dictate movement. This blending of faith and tactics challenges the simplified image of Tubman as either a mystic guided solely by visions or a fearless adventurer driven by impulse. In reality, she was both deeply spiritual and intensely practical. Her belief system gave her endurance, while her strategic mind ensured survival. One without the other would not have been enough to sustain repeated journeys through danger. By weaving together coded communication, psychological insight, and disciplined leadership, Tubman transformed limited resources into effective resistance. Each successful escape reinforced the lessons she carried forward, refining her methods and strengthening the trust placed in her. Her story reveals that resistance was not only an act of defiance, but also an exercise in intelligence, restraint, and preparation. Through this careful fusion of belief and strategy, Tubman demonstrated that survival and liberation depended not on chance, but on the deliberate choices made in the darkest hours. Long before Harriet Tubman became known for guiding others to freedom, her body bore the mark of violence that never truly healed. As a child, she suffered a severe head injury that left her with lifelong seizures, sudden loss of consciousness, and vivid visions that arrived without warning. In a world where physical endurance often meant survival, this condition could have ended her usefulness, her mobility, and her chances of escape. Instead, it became one of the most misunderstood aspects of her life, later smoothed over by stories that portrayed her as physically invincible and untouched by weakness. Tubman lived with pain and unpredictability every day. The seizures could strike at any moment, forcing her into states of vulnerability that others might interpret as fragility. Yet she learned to live inside these limitations, adjusting her movements, conserving energy, and listening closely to her body. Rather than denying her condition, she incorporated it into how she navigated danger. This awareness sharpened her discipline and reinforced her reliance on planning rather than speed or brute strength. She did not outrun threats. She outthought them. The visions that accompanied her seizures were deeply tied to her spiritual life. Tubman believed they carried meaning, offering guidance or warning in moments of uncertainty, while outsiders later reduced these experiences to myth or superstition. Within her own understanding, they reinforced focus and purpose. They did not replace strategy, but they strengthened her resolve to act when logic and fear seemed evenly balanced. Faith and endurance merged with lived experience, creating a resilience rooted not in denial of suffering, but in acceptance of it. This condition also shaped how others perceived her within the resistance network. Those who traveled with Tubman quickly learned that her authority did not come from physical dominance. It came from consistency, judgment, and trust earned over time. Even when her body faltered, her leadership did not. She knew when to rest, when to wait, and when to move, and this patience often meant the difference between safety and exposure. Her presence conveyed calm rather than haste, an essential quality for guiding people whose nerves were already stretched thin by fear. By surviving and leading despite a visible disability, Tubman quietly challenged assumptions about who could resist and how resistance should look. Strength, in her case, was not the absence of weakness, but the ability to act responsibly within it. Each journey she completed reinforced the truth that courage did not require a flawless body. It required clarity of purpose and the discipline to adapt when conditions changed. This reality stands in contrast to later portrayals that elevated her into an almost superhuman figure. Such myths, though meant to honor her, risk erasing the very humanity that made her story powerful. Tubman's achievements are not diminished by her injury. They are magnified by it. Every calculated decision, every return south, every moment of leadership carried additional weight, because she acted while managing pain and uncertainty that never fully left her. Understanding this aspect of Tubman's life brings coherence to the story that unfolds across her journey. Her careful planning, her reliance on networks, her emphasis on discipline, and her blending of faith with strategy all reflect someone who could not afford recklessness. Her resilience was earned daily, shaped by limits she did not choose but refused to surrender to. In confronting the myth of physical invincibility, a deeper truth emerges. Harriet Tubman's power lay not in being untouched by hardship, but in transforming it into resolve, proving that resistance could rise from vulnerability as surely as from strength. When the Civil War began, Harriet Tubman did not step away from the struggle that had defined her life. Instead, the skills she had refined in secrecy found a new setting, one shaped by uniforms, shifting front lines, and fragile alliances. The war transformed the geography of resistance, but it did not change its nature. Information remained power, trust remained essential, and survival still depended on knowing when to move unseen. Tubman entered Union-controlled territory not as a symbol, but as a woman whose experience made her uniquely suited to a conflict that demanded both courage and discretion. Her work began quietly. Serving as a nurse, she tended to wounded soldiers and newly liberated people suffering from illness and exhaustion. She relied on traditional remedies and hard-earned knowledge of survival under scarcity, earning respect through effectiveness rather than title. At the same time, she gathered intelligence, listening carefully to conversations, mapping waterways, and learning the movements of opposing forces. These observations, combined with her ability to move among local black communities, positioned her as a vital source of information that formal channels could not easily access. As a scout and spy, Tubman operated in spaces others could not. She understood the terrain of the South not from maps, but from lived experience. Rivers, swamps, and plantations were not abstract features. They were places with patterns, routines, and vulnerabilities. She coordinated with black informants who knew which routes were guarded, which bridges were mined, and which plantations could be approached without drawing attention. This network mirrored the resistance systems she had worked within for years, now adapted to the needs of a military campaign. These efforts culminated in the Combahee River Raid of 1863. The operation required precise timing and absolute secrecy. Union boats moved through Confederate-held waterways. Guided by intelligence, Tubman helped gather and interpret. As the raid unfolded, plantations along the river were disrupted, and hundreds of enslaved people seized the moment to flee. Chaos favored escape, and preparation turned opportunity into action. More than 700 individuals gained freedom in a single night, not through chance, but through coordination built on trust and local knowledge. Tubman's role in this operation marked a profound turning point. She was not merely assisting from the margins. She was actively shaping strategy and execution. In doing, she became the first woman to lead a military operation for the United States. Though recognition at the time was limited and often withheld, the significance of this achievement lies not only in its scale, but in its continuity with her earlier work. The raid reflected the same principles that had guided her journeys north. Careful planning, reliance on community networks, and an unshakable focus on liberation. The war did not transform Tubman into something new. It revealed the full scope of what she already was. Her transition from underground resistance to formal military action highlights how overlooked expertise can reshape outcomes when given space to operate. The skills developed in the shadows proved indispensable in open conflict, and the line between civilian resistance and military strategy blurred in her hands. This chapter of Tubman's life reinforces the deeper truth running through her story. Freedom was never accidental, and leadership did not require official rank to be real. By carrying her methods into the war effort, Tubman demonstrated that the struggle against bondage was not separate from the nation's conflict, but central to it. Her role in the Combahee River Raid stands as evidence that long before laws changed or victories were declared, liberation was being planned, led, and executed by those who understood its cost most intimately. When the war ended, the world Harriet Tubman returned to bore little resemblance to the freedom she had helped bring into being. The uniforms were folded away, the boats no longer moved under cover of darkness, and the nation turned its attention toward rebuilding itself. For Tubman, however, the struggle did not conclude with victory. The same country that had relied on her knowledge, her courage, and her leadership now struggled to recognize her worth in peacetime. What followed was a quieter chapter of endurance, marked by pursuit or secrecy, but by neglect and delay. Tubman settled in Auburn, New York, where she devoted herself to caring for family members and others in need, many of whom had nowhere else to turn. Her resources were limited, and the physical toll of years spent under strain had not eased. Despite her documented service as a nurse, scout, and guide during the war, she received no immediate compensation. Applications for a military pension moved slowly through layers of bureaucracy that rarely favored black women, especially those whose work had taken place outside conventional records. The problem was not simply paperwork. It reflected a broader pattern in which contributions that fell outside formal titles were dismissed or minimized. Tubman's service had relied on skills developed in spaces the government had never fully acknowledged. Intelligence gathered through trust, leadership exercised without rank, and lives saved through unconventional methods were difficult to measure by official standards. As a result, her role was treated as incidental rather than essential, even though its impact had been undeniable. For decades, Tubman petitioned for recognition, supported by letters from officers and allies who understood what she had done. Progress came in fragments. Eventually, she received a small pension, not for her own military service, but as the widow of a Union soldier. Only later was additional support granted in recognition of her wartime work, and even then, it fell far short of what her service had warranted. The delay was not accidental. It mirrored a system that consistently undervalued the labor and leadership of black women, particularly when their contributions challenged traditional definitions of authority. This period of Tubman's life exposes a striking contrast with the legends that would later surround her name. Public memory elevated her into a symbol of courage, while her daily reality was shaped by financial uncertainty and declining health. She continued to give, opening her home to the elderly and the poor, eventually establishing a residence for those who had been left behind by history. Even in hardship, her commitment to others did not waver. The injustice of her post-war treatment deepens the meaning of her earlier achievements. Tubman had never acted for reward, yet the lack of recognition mattered because it revealed whose sacrifices were considered worthy of honor. Her experience was not unique, but it was especially stark given the scale of her contributions. The same resilience that had carried her through danger now sustained her through years of institutional indifference. By placing this chapter alongside her wartime service, the story gains balance and honesty. Heroism did not guarantee security, and service did not ensure dignity. Tubman's life demonstrates that freedom, once achieved, still required protection and advocacy. Her long fight for recognition underscores a truth that runs through the broader history she helped shape. Progress often arrives unevenly, and justice must be demanded as persistently as it is earned. In enduring this final struggle, Harriet Tubman once again revealed the depth of her strength, reminding us that resistance does not end when the conflict fades from view. To understand Harriet Tubman beyond myth is to see her not as a distant legend, but as part of a larger human story shaped by collective resistance, shared risk, and unfinished work. When we move past simplified images of solitary heroism, her life reveals how freedom was built through networks of trust, careful planning, and the leadership of black women whose names were often left out of official records. Tubman's story becomes not only inspiring, but instructive, offering insight into how change truly happens. Throughout her life, Tubman acted within communities, not above them. Every escape, every wartime mission, and every act of care after the war depended on cooperation. Free black families, formerly enslaved people, scouts, informants, and allies all contributed to outcomes no single individual could have achieved alone. By recognizing this, we honor not just Tubman, but the countless others whose courage sustained resistance in ways history rarely celebrates. Her leadership reminds us that progress is rarely the result of isolated acts, but of people moving together with purpose. Her life also forces us to confront how leadership has been defined and who has been allowed to claim it. Tubman led without formal rank, without wealth, and without institutional protection. As a black woman navigating a society structured to exclude her, she demonstrated authority rooted in experience, discipline, and moral clarity. Understanding her story in this way challenges narrow definitions of power and highlights how marginalized voices have always shaped history, even when recognition came late or not at all. Equally important is what her life tells us about justice as an ongoing process. Emancipation did not bring equality, and victory in war did not guarantee dignity and peace. Tubman's post-war struggles reflect a broader truth. Systems that benefit from courage do not always reward it fairly. Her persistence in the face of neglect shows that resistance does not end when laws change or conflicts conclude. It continues wherever recognition, equity, and care remain incomplete. Seen in full, Tubman's life offers more than inspiration. It provides a framework for understanding how resilience operates under pressure, how communities protect one another, and how leadership can emerge from the margins to alter the course of history. Her story teaches that freedom is not a single moment, but a series of choices made again and again, often by people whose names we may never know. Thank you for spending this time exploring Harriet Tubman's story in depth. If you found value in looking beyond the myth and into the realities that shaped her life and legacy, please support this channel by liking the video and subscribing. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures that history is remembered not just for its symbols, but for the people and struggles that gave it meaning.